Thank you, Christine. Thank you, everyone. I am now going to do that time-honoured thing that all preachers do. They take their watch off and they place it there, which has absolutely no significance or meaning whatsoever in the tradition that I come from. I'd like to read to you from some well-known words from Paul the Apostle. If I speak in the tongues of men and angels but do not have love, I'm only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have faith that can move mountains but I do not have love, I am nothing. If I give up all I possess to the poor and give over my body to hardship that I may boast but do not have love, I gain nothing. Then Paul describes love. Love is patient and kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It's not proud. It does not dishonor others. It's not self-seeking. It's not easily ignored, etc. And then he finishes what we've turned into the 13th chapter of 1 Corinthians. Of course, Paul didn't write in chapters or verses, but he says this, and now these three remain: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. Why does Paul suggest that love is greater than hope? We can't live without hope. Why does Paul suggest that love is greater than faith? We're all members of the Christian faith. But for Paul, faith and hope are good. But love is everything. Why does he say that? It's pretty controversial, actually. It's just that we've got used to it. Hesiod was a great poet who lived 700 years before Jesus, the 8th century BC. And Hesiod wrote many poems. He wrote an epic, which is called Works and Days. And in Works and Days comes up the story that we all know, Pandora. You've heard of Pandora and Pandora's box. And the story is simply this, that Zeus, the king of the gods, is really angry. He's angry with Prometheus because Prometheus has given humans, mankind, it was only men on earth then, not women, he's given men the gift of fire. And Zeus realizes that with the gift of fire, human beings might become too powerful. So he comes up with a cunning plan. He goes to some of his siblings and he asks them to create for him a beautiful woman with a heart of ice. And so Pandora is created, the first woman ever. In fact, this is the Greek mythology around the creation of women. And Zeus gives to Pandora, this beautiful woman with a heart of ice, a box, actually a jar. We got it muddled up in translation. He gives her a jar, and the jar is shut with a big lid. And then he sends her to mankind. And when she arrives, her job is to seduce them. And as she seduces men with her beauty, Zeus cries out his order to open the box. And Pandora opens this box, which is filled, she's been told, with gifts for mankind. And out of the box, on Zeus's order, flies plague and pestilence and war and famine and sickness, illness, disease and death. They all fly out of the box, and then Zeus commands that the box is shut, and Pandora slams down the lid again, leaving just one gift inside, trapped inside the box, never to get out. And Hesiod says, the gift that doesn't get out, that doesn't fly out of the box, is the gift of hope. Hesiod says this, commentating in his poem on his own words. Humanity can live through plague and endure war and suffering and disease. Humanity can even triumph over death. But mankind cannot live without hope. Down through the centuries following that, up to the present day, people have written PhD theses. Scholars have argued and debated what the absence of hope really means. Some have agreed with Hesiod, and some have stood in his way and taken other views. Famously, Plato said, the thing is, there is hope. Hesiod's wrong. Hope does get out of the box, but hope doesn't get out of the box in this life. You have to wait till the next life. This life is plagued with death and disease and famine and war, but the next life, wow. We've heard that sometimes in our churches. There's a lot of Platonic thought that's got into our songs and our choruses and into our hymns and into our sermons. Pie in the sky when you die. I know you're struggling right now, but heaven awaits you. Pure Plato. Plato's great student, Aristotle, took a completely different view. This is how big the debate was in the ancient Greek world. Aristotle said it's not that hope comes after this world. No, it's that we're denied it in this world for our own good. To have hope doesn't help you at all. It makes you lazy. You sit and you ponder. Without hope, we're forced out of our chairs. We're forced to pull our own bootstraps up. Aristotle's thinking is played out in our churches, in our society. Let them pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. I've had to, they should. They're lazy. So we come to the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul was a polymath. We often consider him to be, well, he's an apostle, whatever that means. Paul was probably 6 years younger than Jesus, perhaps 10 years younger than Jesus, but nothing more than that. And Paul, Saul, to give him one of his Hebrew names, Paul didn't change his name to Paul after becoming a Christian, by the way. That's one of those myths that goes round. He had Hebrew names and Greek names. Paul grew up in Tarsus, which was a university city, a Greek-thinking university city, and philosophy was its specialism. He understood Hesiod. He knew what Aristotle said about Hesiod. Everybody knew what Hesiod had said. Everyone debated it. It was on the curriculum every day, each year. He knew what Plato said. He knew that Plato was Aristotle's teacher, but the two disagreed about this great cause of hope. And then this polymath who grew up with Hesiod, who grew up with Plato, who grew up with Aristotle, who studied under Gamaliel, the great Hebrew rabbi, who talked about hope in the future. It's not now, it's not yet, but we're longing for a Messiah to come, a great hope. Paul, Saul, discovers Jesus on a road to Damascus. And in that great moment, that great encounter whereby he's blinded, that great psychological moment, whatever it was, the scholars have also argued about what actually happened to Paul and what kind of breakdown he had, what was going on. But out of that moment, Paul, Saul, this persecutor of this outward fringe called followers of Jesus, comes to understand that in Jesus and through Jesus, hope has actually got out of the box and burst into our realities. He comes to understand a new definition as he thinks through Hesiod's famous words and the commentaries that have gone on through history since then. By the way, they still go on. That's my point. Friedrich Nietzsche writes about Hesiod and hope and etc., etc., etc. But Paul comes to a conclusion that the hope that's denied, that the hope that Gamaliel said was future, when a Messiah came, there would be hope. Paul comes to this conclusion that hope has leapt out of the box through and in Jesus. And because of this, he says, these three remain: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest is love, because hope needs a foundation. Into our society, you're constantly told, have hope, bring hope. We need to be more hopeful. Give our young people hope. I'm involved in schools, 35,000 children in our schools in poor communities. They should have hope, I'm told. Bring them hope. Hope is empty without a foundation. Hope has to rest on something. Faith and hope are important, but the greatest of these is love, because it's love that creates the soil in which hope can thrive. And that was Saul, Paul's experience. An angry man on a mission to destroy the young followers of this upstart, this dead Messiah who can be no Messiah, because a dead Messiah is a useless Messiah. Paul on this mission to wipe out this faction that's polluting Judaism discovers that God is not angry. He's always been angry. He's always been angry and frustrated at the way that the Jewish people have been put down. He's always been angry and frustrated that there is no hope. And into this, he encounters love. He's knocked off his horse, falls to the ground, confronted by the living Jesus, and expects only to be wiped out. But in that moment, he experiences love, forgiveness, hope. And so he writes, faith and hope, they're good. But love is bigger, because love is the foundation of all these things. Jesus summed up the law and the prophets for a young man who was grappling with the Hebrew scriptures. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind, and alongside that, equal to it, love your neighbor as yourself. On these two great commandments hangs all of the law, all of the prophets, all of the writings. They can all be reduced to this, because God is love. And our job is to echo that love, On June the 26th, 2000, Tony Blair went to the White House. And President Bill Clinton and our Prime Minister stood up, and they stood up to announce that the human genome had finally been mapped. The completion of the first survey of the entire human genome had happened. And they said this was to be and would be and was a revolution in preventing, diagnosing, treating, and curing disease. Bill Clinton said this: today we are learning the language in which God created life. With this profound new knowledge, humankind is on the verge of gaining immense new power to heal. June 2020. Today, 23 years later, we now know that none of that was true. Genetics plays a key role in your development and health and growth and the development of your children and the development of the community and its health around you. But we now know, because of neuroscience and the MRI scanner, which was only just beginning to be used, but now we find research coming through, we now know that though genes are important, what really matters most is environment, is experience, is relationship. In those first tender years, primary care given by a mum, given by a dad, to be in a close-knit community where you experience unconditional know that that has more impact on health, and that adult disease begins in those early childhood years. This is scientific fact now, 23 years on. In every acorn, there is the potential of a huge oak tree. But not every acorn grows into a huge oak tree. To grow, to fulfill its potential, soil is needed, climate is needed, irrigation is needed. It's the soil that you're in, it's the climate you're in, it's the surroundings you're in that allow you to grow. Faith, hope, these remain, but the greatest of these is love. And so Paul, Saul, that young man, in that moment, confronted by love unconditionally, changes direction. And he spends the rest of his years serving the cause of bringing love, because that brings hope. The message that hope is out of the box, that God is with us, that God is in us, that God is for us. He spends the rest of his years bringing that message in. Just as our lungs need oxygen, we now know scientifically, I keep saying that because our modern science points us back to these great principles unearthed through the Bible and summed up by Jesus as love. Love for all in the name of God. As our lungs need oxygen, we need the experience of love in our young years. René Descartes made a giant mistake. It wasn't his fault. There was little that he could do about it. He said, as you know, I think, therefore I am. There's not a neurologist, a neuroscientist, a psychologist on earth that would now agree with that statement. We now know that emotion and experience is the ground of cognition. We now know that we learn before we are able to put thoughts together. We now know that those first months spent in a mother's womb are so important for health. We now know that in those first hours, I have 4 children and they were all born in the 1980s. And my wife, Cornelia, would tell you time and time again that she wanted to hold on to a firstborn baby, but they prized the baby away and it went in a little cribby thing next door because the mother needed to get sleep. But the mother couldn't sleep because the mother knew that touch, that love, that unconditional acceptance is so important. Our science has caught up with our intuition, and it's catching up with the teaching of Jesus. I think, therefore I am. No, I experience, I love, therefore I am. The latest research tells us this, that the way I treated my children when they were naughty, go and sit on the step out there. Sit on that step, the naughty step or the learning step. And when you've calmed down and when you can behave, you can come back in and have a meal or come back into the living room. We now know, not because psychologists tell us, but because we can watch the parts of the brain lighting up in a child as they're given instruction live, that is conditional love. You're out, but you can get back in if you behave. How many adults do you know who struggle with self-acceptance? Wonderful Christians filling churches who underneath are so ashamed because I've been naughty and I best not tell anyone. Paul encounters the God who is love. Our task is simply to echo that. Some years ago, in one of our schools, where we were going to start a school, in the city of Bristol, we now run 10 schools in the city of Bristol, some years ago. I went to a housing estate and I was asked to meet a young 15-year-old girl who'd been excluded from her school. And I sat in the front room of this damp, dingy council estate house with a 15-year-old and a newborn baby, 2 weeks old. She'd been excluded from school, she'd been groomed, she'd become pregnant. There she sat with nothing. She didn't know her father. Her mother, because of her own struggles, wasn't emotionally available to her at all. And I sat there with this girl, and I believe God spoke to me. Because I looked into that girl's eyes, and I looked at her as she held this 14-day-old baby. And I could see what she was saying through her tears. She was saying, I will not let you down. What I've endured, what I've suffered will not be repeated. I will not allow to happen to you what I have known. I learned that day that the kingdom of God is here, that the God of love was there, and that it was my job not to bring God's love, but to join in, to echo, to support, to back up. I put it to you that Paul says, for you to think about, what do you think? Faith, hope, and love remain. But the greatest of these is love. And it's our job, the church's job, humanity's job, to echo God, to echo Christ, as hope leaps out of the box called love. Thank you. I don't really know what I'm supposed to do now.
So I'm going to talk to you, Steve, because no one else seems to want to. Thank you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thank you.
So you used a text. I'm just going to ask you a couple of questions to Steve and dialogue a bit, and then over to you guys. You started with 1 Corinthians 13, but in a sense your text was, well, you went to Hesiod and that general sense of a classical heritage, and then you located that as Paul's context. Tell us about how you begin crafting something like that, in the sense of the power of the sermon lies in coming to the illustration of the 15-year-old girl. Once you've piled up all the details about faith, which is largely assumed, and then hope, which is explained through the Pandora story, and then suddenly at the end we completely get the sense, and then you describe love as the box. Is what you're doing there, in a sense, using a wider text than simply Scripture? And what authority does that wider text have? And where does our common human experience play into that? And to what extent are you, in a sense, not only making the sermon, but actually providing the text for people by bringing them into your experience of life them sharing it, and then you speaking out of that. Tell us about the thinking with that.
For me, I grew up in a Baptist church, and I have listened to more sermons than I literally had hot dinners, I'm sure, through the years. And most of the sermons, or many of the sermons I listen to, I know exactly where they're going to end, even in the first sentence. I just know where it's going. I know, this one's about the Trinity. This one's about, kind of like... So it strikes me that a preacher's art, of which I'm a learner, not a master, is to take people by surprise, which is what Jesus did. When I was at theological college, I was taught, Sam, that you should take a text and you should slowly exegete that text. And then I noticed that Jesus didn't seem to have been to that lecture. He didn't seem to get it. If you read through, well, as we all do, through the stories and the stories about Jesus, Jesus told stories. He told surprising stories. He began with stories that people had either heard and then he stood them on their head and twisted them round and took them by surprise in that way, or he made stories up. And he lived and taught by doing things, telling stories, and asking questions. So I have, over the years, tried to adopt that into my preaching style so that people are on, perhaps not the edge of their seats, but not asleep because they don't quite know where this is going and don't find out until the last line. And I always think, by the way, the best films are like that, don't you think? There are films you watch, you go, I know what this is. It's a rom-com. They love each other. They find each other. They fall out in the middle. They get back together at the end. Do you know, I love a film where you're just thinking, what's all this about? And it's only in the last 5 minutes that you go, aha. I think that's what Jesus did.
And tell us about the tone as well, because obviously we're very different people, and my approach to these things is to be gentle and usually slow pace. So sometimes vary the pace, but one thing that most people don't know about me is I had a rugby injury when I was 20, which means I can't shout even if I try. So you started that sermon in a tone of voice I couldn't reach, even if that was the climax, as it were. So we have to, knowing yourself is 3/4 of it, but you started with that, hey guys, there's this Hesiod guy, and I want to tell you, he told this story, and you sort of know it, but actually you don't know it, and you're already up here. Do you see what I mean? Tell us about that, Well, is that a sort of, hey guys, I've got some big news and I'm just going to blurt it all out to you? Is that, tell us about whether that's a conscious thing, that's you working with your personality? How does that work?
It is working with my personality. My wife always tells me off for shouting. If she was here, she'd say, you spoke too loud. You spoke too loud. So I practice trying to be quieter. And that was just, I do. See, I'm a complete failure at it. Because I realised that, there should be peaks and there should be troughs and, it should be calm and you should be loud, etc. I think in this context, because, again, I'm used to speaking for longer, I kind of think, wow, I don't want to run over the programme and not leave time for questions, so I've got to get it all in fast, and that kind of makes me a bit louder. I also think this, though. Sam sat down having preached and said to me, we were talking together, he said, you were writing your sermon during mine. And actually, that's not really true. What I do, though, my style of doing things, is I kind of research, etc., etc. I'm trying to bring together in all of my life my theology, my understanding of psychology, my understanding of education, the work that we're doing. So I'm drawing on those themes all of the time and bringing them together because I think that's our task. But I would say this, and we all have different styles. And I think in watching Sam preach, I often will ring Sam, as Sam knows, after he's been on Thought for the Day, and I just say, that was so brilliant. You know, if I could put words together as Sam can, I'd be a lot quieter. You know? and more considered. But what I would say is this. I always think there are 3 V's of communication. And they are firstly the visual, and then the vocal, and then the verbal. The visual accounts for about 70 or 80% of what you'll ever get across. So by not reading, but what I did, you see, whilst Sam was speaking, is I just rewrote my notes, you know, as short headings. So from a long script that I had, I took it down to a set of notes like that, see? And by writing it again, it gets in my head more, so I know where I'm going, so I can live it, which sets me free from a text for me, which allows me to use my hands and my eyes and move towards you, because I've learned that these things are really important. If I stand here and I say to you, I'm really enjoying being here this morning, I found it fascinating. I convey to you the very opposite of if I look at you and go, I've really enjoyed being here this morning, I've just found it fascinating. The same words, the opposite meaning, because our use of our eyes, our use of our gestures, everything that is visual really matters in communication. And then the vocal is the next most powerful, how you use your voice. The words you actually say, in all of the research, go away and research it, come out last. They account for a very small proportion, which is why when someone says, I love you, you don't believe them.
Lovely, thank you. Okay, guys. Where's the microphone? Oh, yeah, Christine's got the microphone. Terrific.
Thank you. In those wonderful words from St. Paul that sadly so often get relegated only to weddings and not actually preached enough about in the church, he says, you know, now we only see in a mirror dimly. And as I'm sure, you know, if you study science, you'll know that many scientific discoveries that were scientific fact then are now put in the bin. I wonder how much certainty the preacher should have in, you know, when people say, clearly the Bible says X, and there'll be people thinking, does it?
Yeah, I think that's a really good statement. We have to be extremely careful of our interpretation of biblical words, which is why it's good to say, I don't know if I said it, I hope I inferred it as I was speaking, what do you think? Do you know? Here's a question. What do you make of this? I'll often say as part of a sermon that I give or a talk that I give, the way I see it is like this. Sometimes I'll say to our congregation, not too often because you don't want to bore them by saying it, I say, a great sermon isn't one you go home and necessarily agree with. A great sermon is one that you'll go home and debate around and bring your understanding to. And I think that we've too often looked at the person at the front, which has traditionally been a man, spewing what was called truth out, and if it's said, we believe it. That, by the way, is far more prominent in Christianity than it is in Judaism, as I'm sure you'll know. I have the opportunity of speaking in a whole number of synagogues now, which is always a wonderful experience, and it's much more of a community affair. You debate, you discuss, you find meaning, you lean back on the rabbis of the past, you search together. I think that the more we can move in that direction, and the more preachers can enable congregations to think their own thoughts and pose questions, the further we get back to Jesus, who, of course, was a rabbi.
Carolyn, thank you so much for that sermon. But the thing that I'm curious about is how we choose the stories we tell. Because that story you told at the end was a massive trigger for me. And I think when we tell stories, it's just weighing up how we tell them in a way that we really weigh our words carefully. We think about the congregations listening. And just that whole question of telling stories well to fit. I mean, it did fit. It was very powerful, but it was a trigger. And I'm just curious to know how we do that. How, maybe both of you, yeah.
So as Sam said so wisely, begin with the end. Where's this going? What's the point of this? How does it land? By the way, let me say is that I also totally agree with what Sam says. Sometimes in our churches there are half a dozen or perhaps 10 Oasis churches now, and we talk about cooking the sermon. And what happens is that the person who's it doesn't always happen because there's not time, but the person who's going to deliver a talk will gather a group of friends, you know, down at the pub over a glass of wine or wherever it might be, a mug of coffee, and just chat it through. That's always a great experience, isn't it? When you talk all this through, it gets better. And the link with your question is that stories often arise out of that. But it so happens that this morning, as I went through all of this first thing this morning about 6 o'clock, and I had a story of somebody called Nathan that I didn't tell you, and a story about Jake and Philip, a teenager and an 80-year-old man that I know that I didn't tell you, and the story of the Californian redwoods that I didn't tell you. And so all of these illustrations came to me from books I've written or articles I've read or films I've watched. I watch films or have conversations, and I'm always writing notes. I don't know if you do that. I'm just forever writing down stories. I do them on my iPad. Half the time when I go back to them, I can't remember what it was anyway, and it's lost. But sometimes I think, that's a brilliant story, that's a brilliant story. And then as I'm putting together a talk, these stories come to mind because they resonate with the theme you're developing. And I normally find, as I did in this case, I kick out loads of stories because they're good, but they didn't quite fit as well. They made a point slightly different to the main one. So that's how I choose, but I'm always on the hunt for stories.
Hello, I'm Remco from Antwerp, so pardon my French. I thought you made quite a risk. You took quite a risk when you were talking about Bill Clinton, not because he's smoking cigars or so, but more like you say that there is now a certain way of thinking about the human genome and how it affects us. I'm wondering, why would you take such a risk when in 10 years there can be another opinion about it, and build your sermon on it?
Yeah, so I didn't regard it as a risk, and nor did I mean it in any sense to talk badly about Bill Clinton or Tony Blair, who, by the way, has just done a quote from my latest book, so I'm very... So it wasn't a way of putting Bill or Tony down at all. It's just to tell you how much we have learned in the last 25 years about our need to be saturated in love. We know that now as a science. The genome, the mapping of the genome and genetics are really critically important. But we know that though your genes may give you a disposition to something, the influences in your life, we know as a fact now, because of the MRI scanner, we can actually see it happening. And we know that a person starved of love, a child starved of love, will not develop, will struggle to develop to their full potential. But we're just finding out about 30-year-olds and 40-year-olds and 50-year-olds and 60-year-olds. I would say from the womb to the tomb, love means more than anything else. It's what our science tells us. So I think if Bill Clinton or Tony Blair were here, they'd smile. Yeah, that's what we thought 25 years ago. It was cutting edge, but it's not now.
Okay, huge thanks to Steve for a magnificent presentation.
Thank you.